GPT-5 will be the next level in artificial intelligence, and it will be developed by OpenAI. Now, this video will cover everything you need to know about GPT-5, including timelines, how smart it's going to be, different modalities, and many things that you may have not thought of before. This is because since the inception of GPT-4, there have been hundreds of different research papers that will fundamentally shape the way that GPT-5 is created. And this is going to be largely different from how GPT-4 was trained on and is going to be built. This includes, but is not limited to, the thought process, the risks, the limitations, and the regulations of this model. So let's get into exactly what GPT-5 is going to be based on everything we know, including statements from Sam Altman himself. So if we're going to talk about GPT-5, we first, of course, need to talk about the release date. That is one of the most anticipated things that people do want to know. Now, it isn't impossible to gauge when GPT-5 is going to be released. This is because Sam Altman has said some key statements that can indicate as to when we could expect GPT-5 to be released. So let's take a look at some of the timelines of GPT-4, what he said about GPT-5, and use that to estimate when GPT-5 is likely going to be released. So firstly, you need to understand the 3 stages of building a large language model, or whatever AI system it's going to be. Stage 1 is data collection. That's where you collect the relevant sources that you're going to train the model on. Stage 2 is, of course, fine-tuning the model. So you first need to understand that with GPT-4, it was finished way before it was released. Although GPT-4 was released in March of 2023, they actually finished GPT-4 in August of 2022. But they had to spend 7 months aligning the model, making it safe for public use. In addition to that, they also started data collection in 2021. This means that the inception of GPT-4 started around 2 years before its initial release, and we are likely to see the same kind of timelines for GPT-5. So the question is, when are they going to start training GPT-5? And I think I do have a little bit of an answer. So if we take a look at this clip from Sam Altman testifying at a Senate artificial intelligence hearing, he actually talks about GPT-5. So in this talk, what he references is an artificial intelligence paper where they want to delay the progression of any artificial intelligence tool greater than GPT-4. That's because there are concerns as to how great and the capabilities of that model will be. But this is where Sam Altman gives us a slight glimpse at when he's going to start training GPT-5 or potentially collecting said data. So take a look at this clip.
What about you, Mr. Altman? Do you agree with that? Would you pause any further development for 6 months or longer?
So first of all, after we finished training GPT-4, we waited more than 6 months to deploy it. We are not currently training what will be GPT-5. We don't have plans to do it in the next 6 months. But I think the frame of the letter is wrong. What matters is audit.
So what Sam Altman just said there was that he's not going to train GPT-5 in the next 6 months. Now, if we take a look at the dates, we can try and calculate what he means by this. So if it's May and he said that we're not going to train GPT-5 for the next 6 months, this means that training could start in December at the 7th month. And this also means that potentially data collection for GPT-5 has already started. This is because he hasn't mentioned anything about data collection for GPT-5. The only thing that he has mentioned about GPT-5 is, of course, the fact that they haven't started training the model on the data that they've collected. So it is likely that data collection for GPT-5 has started. In addition, if you go ahead to OpenAI's help area, you can see that OpenAI actually does use consumer data to train future models, and they state that you can opt out of this by doing that in a specific setting. Although many may not do so, it is indicative of the fact that they might actually already be collecting data for GPT-5, and I do think that this is already started. So based on the fact that training is likely to start at the end of the year around December times, it may be that if it does take another 8 to 9 months to train the model and then another 8 to 9 months to finish, of course, aligning that model, we could expect GPT-5 to be released sometime in late 2025. Now, of course, this is just a rough estimate based on what they've told us, but that is a conservative estimate based on the training times, the dates that Sam Altman himself has stated, and what we know. The only thing that might lead to GPT-5 being released earlier is of course increased competition. We know that Google is going to be producing something called Gemini, and we know that that is likely to beat or surpass GPT-4. So then, of course, we have token size window. So in the context of a large language model, a token size window typically refers to the number of tokens that the model considers as context when generating or predicting the next token in a sequence. Tokens are a unit of text such as words or subwords that the model processes. The token size window is a parameter that determines how much context the model can take into account. For example, if the context size window is set to 128, it means that the model considers the previous 128 tokens when making predictions. Now, currently, we do know that GPT-4 exists in two versions, a 4,000 context token window and a 32,000 token context window. Now, this, of course, at its time was revolutionary, but since the inception of GPT-4, there have been major advancements in the ability to process large volumes of text. For example, we've already seen Anthropic release a 100,000 context window AI. Now, if you don't know what their AI is, it's called Claude. It's an AI that's quite similar to ChatGPT 3.5, but this 100,000 context window version can process entire novels and entire books. This means that if you wanted to input a whole trilogy, an entire movie, or multiple books, and then ask it about a specific word, it simply could, which means that the applications for this are going to be incredible. So it is likely that GPT-5, if it is released, will likely have a much larger context size window. Additionally, since the inception of GPT-4, there was a research paper called Scaling to 1 million tokens and Beyond with RMT. So with this research paper, they demonstrated the ability to get to 1 million tokens and beyond with a recurrent memory transform. And it will be interesting to see if this research paper is used in developing GPT-5, because we do know that a larger context window does present a much larger ability for a wider range of tasks. There's only a small limitation of this though, where the ability to memorize, detect, and their reasoning drops a bit substantially after around 500,000 tokens. So I do think that there will likely be versions that are separate that we currently have, perhaps maybe at around 100,000 tokens. Then of course, we need to talk about different modalities. Currently, as you know, GPT-4 was released with two modalities. However, even though GPT-4 was released with two modalities such as text and image recognition, we do know that currently these large language models haven't actually added that functionality just yet. As of recording this video, the only data that we've seen of GPT-4 being able to analyze images was from a very small test group on Microsoft Bing. This means that they are still trying to roll out GPT-4 with images as we speak. So now that we've discussed the different modalities that GPT-5 is likely to have, we also need to discuss the parameter size and of course how it's going to be trained. So one graphic that we did see scattered around the internet is of course this famous image where you see GPT-3's parameter count and then of course you see GPT-4's. However, this simple image where you see 175 billion and 100 trillion isn't true. GPT-4's current parameter count isn't actually publicly available, although many estimate it to be currently at 1 trillion tokens. Now, this is of course because when you try to use GPT-4 at its current state, it is much slower to respond, much slower than GPT 3.5. So that is not an overestimate. However, recent developments in the artificial intelligence landscape have proven that larger parameter count doesn't mean that the language model is likely to get better. The problem is that upping the parameter count doesn't mean anything if your data is going to be low quality. So the parameter count of GPT-5 is likely to be unknown. This is because with GPT-4, it was only trained on text. And if it is trained on images, then that is going to be a huge number of parameters that we can't account for.
We can predictably say this much compute, this big of a neural network, this training data, this will be the capabilities of the model. Now, we can predict how it'll score on some tests. What we're really interested in, which gets to the latter part of your question, is can we predict the qualitative new things? Just the new capabilities that didn't exist at all in GPT-4 that do exist in future versions like GPT-5. That seems important to figure out. But right now we can say, here's how we predict it'll do. There are a lot of things about coding that I think are particularly great modality to train these models on. But that won't be, of course, the last thing we train on. I'm very excited to see what happens when we can really do video. Yeah. There's a lot of video content in the world. There's a lot of things that are, I think, much easier to learn with video than text. There's a huge debate in the field about whether a language model can get all the way to AGI. Can you represent everything that you need to know in language? Is language sufficient, or do you have to have video? I personally think it's a dumb question because it probably is possible, but the fastest way to get there, the easiest way to get there will be to have these other representations like video in these models as well. Again, like text is not the best for everything, even if it's capable of representing it.
So potentially, depending on the number of modalities that it is trained on, it could be larger or it could be smaller. But we do know that if GPT-5 was just text-based, the parameter count would be significantly smaller. That is because recent papers have shown that the effectiveness of your data matters much more when training your large language model than actually upping the parameter count. Let me show you some examples showing you that a smaller parameter count is more effective than a larger parameter count when you use high quality data to train your large language model. So if they're going to train a GPT-5, we can refer to this paper by Microsoft released recently. In this paper, they talk about textbooks are all you need. And basically what they state is that when we had high quality data versus low quality data, we increased the effectiveness of our large language model 3 times. And the only thing we did was switch the training data. This means that if they switch the training data to 3 different methods that we're about to talk about, we could see a 3x jump in the quality and responsiveness of GPT-5, even if the parameter count does not increase. So I can simply summarize the Phi 1 paper by saying that they had a large language model that was trained on 1.3 billion tokens, and it achieved comparable results on par with other large language models that were trained on 16 billion tokens and 175 billion tokens, including GPT 3.5. So it did on par with or better with significantly less parameters, which means that GPT-5 doesn't need a large number of parameters to be effective. All it needs is high quality data. Additionally, something else that they're going to do, which is likely to be done with GPT-5, is resulting from this paper, Show You're Working. So OpenAI did release a paper which talked about how they increased the ability of the raw version of GPT-4 just by using a different method of prompting. So essentially, this new method of training was they trained 2 reward models, one for providing positive feedback on the final answer to a math problem, and another for rewarding intermediate reasoning steps. By rewarding a good reasoning, the model achieved a surprising success rate of 78.2% on a math test, almost doubling the performance of GPT-4 and outperforming models that only rewarded correct answers. The approach of rewarding good reasoning steps extends beyond the mathematics and shows promise in various domains like calculus, chemistry, and physics. So the paper highlights the importance of alignment and process supervision, training models to produce a chain of thought endorsed by humans, which is considered safer than focusing solely on correct outcomes, which essentially just means that when you get these large language models to think step by step, these large language models double their efficiency simply based on this chain of thought reasoning, which means that the output that you're going to get is going to be twice as good, which means that GPT-5 is likely to incorporate this into its mechanism for outputting prompts, which means even if you put in a simple prompt, you won't need to say, let's think step by step. It will have that thought process originally, and the output process is going to be much better. Then, of course, we have another research paper which blows everything out of the water. So, as we talked about before, the way in which you prompt GPT-4 or the large language model can make the large language model improve by a 2x or a 3x, okay? And with GPT-5, I do know that they are trying to increase the capability. Now, this paper called Tree of Thoughts increased GPT-4's reasoning ability by 900%, which is the base model increased by 900% just by changing the words that you input to it. So essentially, in this paper, they talked about how they used a tree of thoughts prompting. Essentially, what it means is that if you think about every time you can make a decision, there are about 5 different outcomes. The large language model was asked to rate every single decision from number 5 being the best decision or number 1 being the worst decision. Then every single time they went through that decision, they then continued that same process to the end, and essentially ranking all the different outputs and essentially thinking about what is the best output that you could get by, of course, going through every possible output. And this, of course, increased the reasoning by 900%. So if we know that tree of thought is going to be implemented into GPT-5, which it most likely will be, this could increase GPT-5's reasoning by a huge amount. So along with data and training it very differently, the parameter size is of course hard to come by, but I do think that the quality of GPT-5 will be absolutely incredible. If we take a look at how smart GPT-5 is going to be, as we discussed earlier on in the video, there are countless different examples of research papers and new different research papers coming out every single week that showcase the ability to increase the effectiveness of large language models without changing anything. Now, we do know that data and stuff like that is going to increase the capabilities, but one thing we haven't talked about is how is GPT-5 going to perform. Currently, we do know that GPT-4 was a huge leap in advancement from GPT 3.5, and GPT-4 is absolutely outstanding. We do know that GPT-4, for example, was able to pass the bar exam and was able to get around 90% on various different tests that are benchmarks for artificial intelligence. So knowing this, it is currently estimated that if GPT-5 manages to succeed in its ability to reason, think critically, and include these tree of thoughts way of thinking, that it could theoretically achieve around 99% on pretty much every test there is. We know that it's already great at math, already knows every single subject that there is. The only thing we need to do is pretty much fine tune everything in one last cycle, which is why many people are thinking that GPT-5 will truly be very close to AGI. In addition, to remember that GPT-5 will have images embedded in it, and of course, we know that the performance of GPT-4 greatly increased when vision was acquired. So many of the exam questions that GPT-4 took, they took them with vision and without vision, so they were able to see diagrams, and some of them didn't have diagrams, and when they were able to see these diagrams, GPT-4 with vision improved significantly. Then of course, we need to talk about the various limitations that GPT-5 will implement, because although GPT-5 is going to be absolutely insane when you think about everything before that we discussed, from higher context windows to image, audio, and of course to new ways of thinking and prompting, GPT-4 and GPT 3.5 still struggle with the most basic concepts. And you might think that is a ridiculous statement, but please look at this TED Talk where they document where AI is incredibly smart and also shockingly foolish because it cannot understand basic concepts. But let the video explain it better because it's going to do a better job. So all the video is going to show you is a simple question, a common sense question that it doesn't take a genius to answer, but GPT-4 continually gets it wrong.
AI is passing the bar exam. Does that mean that AI is robust at common sense? You might assume so, but you never know. So suppose I left 5 clothes to dry out in the sun, and it took them 5 hours to dry completely. How long would it take to dry 30 clothes? GPT-4, the newest, greatest AI system, says 30 hours. Not good. A different one. I have 12-liter jug and 6-liter jug, and I want to measure 6 liters. How do I do it? Just use the 6-liter jug, right? GPT-4 spits out some very elaborate nonsense. Step 1, fill the 6-liter jug. Step 2, pour the water from 6 to 12-liter jug. Step 3, fill the 6-liter jug again. Step 4, very carefully pour the water from 6 to 12-liter jug. And finally, you have 6 liters of water in the 6-liter jug that should be empty by now.
So with that, it's going to be interesting to see how they do solve this issue. I haven't been aware of any solutions just yet, but it will be interesting to see if they even focus on this, because largely we do gloss over these problems and just focus on the interesting stuff. Next, of course, now that you know that we don't really understand exactly what AI is doing, we also need to talk about emergent capabilities. Now, this is something that we've spoken about previously in the past, but you have to understand that GPT-5 is likely to be a few echelons better than GPT-4. This means that even if the parameter count is the same, a few emergent capabilities are going to be seen in GPT-5 that we simply cannot predict that have been in GPT-4. Now, one of GPT-4's most emergent capability was theory of mind. And theory of mind essentially is where an AI is able to think about how other people are thinking in certain situations. Now, of course, this is particularly worrying if you are thinking about how an AI could potentially manipulate humans to get it to do things from it. Because of course, these large language models do have access to almost every piece of text on the earth. And that means it's not limited to other books about persuasion, manipulation, and of course, persuasion tactics. Now, take a look at this clip that perfectly explains emergent capabilities. You've likely seen it before, but for those of you who hadn't, you really need to understand, because this emergent capabilities phenomenon is likely to be one of the reasons that they don't release GPT-5 on time, because if there is an emergent capability, then the AI researchers or OpenAI will need to learn how to effectively contain it or potentially remove this capability.
Some people use the metaphor that AI is like electricity. But if I pump even more electricity through the system, it doesn't pop out some other emergent intelligence, some capacity that wasn't even there before, right? And so a lot of the metaphors that we're using, again, paradigmatically, you have to understand what's different about this new class of Golem, generative large language model AIs.
This is one of the really surprising things talking to the experts, because they will say, these models have capabilities we do not understand how they show up, when they show up, or why they show up. Again, not something that you would say of like the old class of AI. So here's an example. These are two different models, GPT and then a different model by Google. And there's no difference in the models. They just increase in parameter size. That is, they just get bigger.
What are parameters, Asa?
It's just like the number essentially of weights in a matrix. So it's just the size. You're just increasing the scale of the thing. And what you see here, and I'll move into some other examples that might be a little easier to understand, is that you ask these AIs to do arithmetic, and they can't do them, and at some point, boom, they just gain the ability to do arithmetic. No one can actually predict when that'll happen. Here's another example, which is you train these models on all of the internet, so it's seen many different languages, but then you only train them to answer questions in English. So it's learned how to answer questions in English, but you increase the model size, and at some point, boom, it starts being able to do question and answers in Persian. No one knows why.
Now, we've already seen that clip on emergent capabilities, but I do think this is also going to show you exactly why AI has these emergent capabilities. You have to understand that although we can see the outputs of artificial intelligence models like GPT-5 and GPT-4, we still don't know what they're actually doing. So take a look at this tweet right here. It says, this person tweeted, "These engineers never speak a word or document anything. Their results are bizarre and inhuman. This guy trained a tiny transformer to do addition, then spent weeks figuring out what it was doing. One of the only times in history someone has understood how a transformer works. And transformers are essentially the building blocks of these large language models." Then of course, you can see here, this is the algorithm it created to add two numbers. And you can see here, this is a large, simple, complex calculation that it's doing to add two simple numbers, which is pretty crazy if you ask me. Which means that these AIs think completely different to us. This example shows us that this artificial intelligence thought about basic math as rotation around a circle, which goes to show that although it might tell us an answer, it doesn't tell us how it got there. And this is what's so scary about AI. We would never know that it's thinking about rotations around a circle when performing simple addition, but it is, which means that we need to ensure that these artificial intelligence are completely aligned, because if you release something like that into the public, the risks could be existential. That brings us onto one of the last points which we need to talk about, and that is of course regulation. So currently, there are many challenges relating to regulating AI while dealing with the speed of artificial intelligence developments. However, recently, there has been an announcement which does show a little bit of hope. Recently, the UK is set to get early or priority access to AI models from Google and OpenAI. The UK Prime Minister stated that we're working with the Frontier Labs, Google DeepMind, OpenAI, and Anthropic, and I'm pleased to announce that they've committed to give early or priority access to models for research and safety purposes to help better evaluations and help us better understand the opportunities and risks of these systems. Additionally, the European Union is working on the AI Act, a global first that could set the benchmark for other countries. The legislation aims to regulate all automated technology, including algorithms, machine learning tools, and logic tools. The AI Act has been criticized by some European companies such as Renault, Heineken, Airbus, and Siemens for its potential to jeopardize Europe's competitiveness and technical advantages. The US has also proposed a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which covers aspects such as safe and effective systems, algorithmic discrimination protections, data privacy, notice and explanation, and human alternatives. The US is making progress in developing domestic AI regulation, including the National Institute of Standards and Technology, AI Risk Management Framework, and existing laws and regulations that apply to AI systems. And of course, many people are trying to currently restrict GPT-5. If you haven't heard already, there is that letter, which is an open letter that says pause giant AI experiments, an open letter. We call on all labs to immediately pause for at least 6 months to pause the training of AI systems more powerful than GPT-4. And essentially, they state that even though recent months have seen AI labs locked out in an out of control race to develop and deploy ever more powerful digital minds that no one, not even their creators, can understand, predict, or reliably control. Therefore, we call on all labs to immediately pause for at least 6 months for the training of AI systems more powerful than GPT-4. But as we do know that this is very unlikely to happen, this is because we do live in a capitalistic world, which means there is a lot of incentive to providing the best products. So there are even rumors that China's Baidu has claimed its Ernie bot beats ChatGPT on key tests in artificial intelligence as the AI race continues to heat up. And this will be something we do cover in another video, because if these other countries are going to be working on trying to beat GPT-4, there isn't really an initiative to slow down unless there is some sort of global AI regulation body that can ensure they all slow down. And even if you do get the large companies to slow down, there is no guarantee you don't have solo coders in their rooms working on large language models that eventually surpass the larger ones. In addition, we did make another video where we did talk about how GPT-5 is extremely risky. This is because from Google DeepMind, they did talk about how, with of course emergent capabilities and AI being able to learn rapidly, we have literally no idea what they're going to be capable of. And of course, Google has deemed any model greater than GPT-4, namely GPT-5, to be extremely risky. So that leaves us to the question, are you excited for GPT-5 or are you more afraid? Because although GPT-5 is likely to be a huge advancement, there are a number of unfortunate circumstances that will arise from GPT-5, such as job loss and of course the possibility of bad actors to use these large language models with jailbreaks to harm society.